Hello, and thank you for tuning in to The Christian Skeptic. I'm your host, Sean Kerwin, and as always, it's my mission to take an honest look at our questions about Christianity through the lens of logic and reason. I'm not here to preach at you, just to start a conversation with you. I hope you enjoy the show. Well, let me start off this show, first and foremost, with an apology. I apologize for not posting content as frequently as I had hoped to at the start of this new year. I unfortunately struggled with a lot of sickness in January, on top of some travel that I needed to do for work, which only made the sickness worse, and I was unable to record some of the episodes I wanted to record. And this one in particular, I kind of regret not recording sooner, but it seems we are, at least if you pay any attention to social media and things going on online, in the middle of some very heated disagreements on topics that are offensive and hard to process and deal with, and have once again placed a clear dividing line between those who would say they are more conservative in their political views and those who would say they are more liberal in their political views. And for the rest of us who don't feel like we fit in that camp, they've left us, at least me, feeling a bit more disgusted with social media and the hesitation for people to literally go outside and touch grass and instead stir up anger and say really cutting and hurtful things to other people online. And I have a hunch that even if you're not listening to this episode the day that I post it, maybe you might be listening to it a year from now. I have a feeling that the same thing can kind of be said. No matter what's coming, it seems we've entered a place and a space where what I'm talking about is a normal and observable part of our reality, especially our reality online. Now, I was fortunate enough during some of my sickness to not spend a lot of time online, and therefore was unaware of some of the things going on in the world. And I'll add, blissfully unaware of some of the things going on in the world. When I was told that others were freaking out about the latest controversy, I was doing some maintenance in my front yard and happily enjoying some good weather. Nevertheless, I've been met recently with some interesting conversations. And as you can tell by the title of today's episode, there's a reality that people are noticing and have noticed for a while now, which is that in the evangelical and Protestant population in the United States of America, and probably in other parts of the world, but I don't live there, I live here, so I'm going to speak to this, and if you're from one of those other parts of the world, I'm sure what I'm going to discuss is no surprise, but I am curious if what we're going to talk about today lines up with your experience. So leave me a comment right into the show. I'd love to hear from you. But back to it. The majority of Protestant evangelical America votes conservatively, votes for the Republican Party, and holds conservative views. And one other interesting thing I want to point out, because I think Protestant evangelical Christians often, especially by those that don't attend church, become the stereotype of what all Christians are, value, and believe. And my good friend Gary, shout out Gary, thank you for listening to the show, brought it to my attention that Catholic believers, the majority of them actually vote more liberally, or more in the Democratic Party here in the U.S., which I'll touch on that here in a second. But back to the main question, why do Christians, and again, I'm going to use this term kind of loosely here, and that's why I wanted to make the distinction that Catholic believers are not necessarily lumped in with the term Christians as I'm going to use it, but just for purposes of discussion and because we have a limited time to discuss anything here on the show, I'm just going to move forward with that general umbrella term Christians, but just note that I'm referring to the general Protestant evangelical population of believers in the United States of America. So why do they vote more conservatively than liberally? And I think there's a few reasons. I think without thinking about it too much, we can point to issues like abortion, issues like gender pronouns and fluidity and the policies surrounding those, and issues concerning personal liberties. And I think it's no secret, and I don't want to dwell on that too much for this discussion, but it's no secret that in Christianity, there are kind of some clear-cut, obvious answers to these issues. And so I'm going to make statements, and they might come across as offensive. I'm not going to apologize for it. But just know that that's not my intent. My intent here is to address the elephant in the room and say the thing that everyone's thinking, not to offend you. So my only ask here is that we can have a rational, philosophical discussion as intellectuals here. And any emotions that we feel, we can recognize that we feel them, but press on for the sake of philosophical truth. Okay? Okay. So, Christians largely oppose abortion. And I think that's obviously due to the fact that, for the Christian, abortion is murdering an unborn child. And the Bible expressly forbids murder. So, Christians are more often than not going to stand on the side that is against legalized abortion and against furthering the lines in which that abortion is legalized. And we can discuss this more on a different episode if you want, so let me know. But that's all I'm going to say on that for now. For Christians, there are only two genders. The Bible clearly says God made them male and female. So the question then of gender fluidity, pronouns, policies concerning that is a non-starter. And so there are views, and I do want to point out new views, that 20 years ago, there wasn't disagreement on some of these views. And that's a reality too, is that go back 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and the party lines weren't as distinctly drawn across religious boundaries as they are now. And I think the Catholic Church is evidence of that, because the Catholic Church is one that is more traditional and also one that is more social. And I think that's another important distinction, is that the Protestant evangelical church is one that focuses more on the individual relationship with God versus the communal relationship with God. And the Catholic Church focuses more on the community aspect of relationship with God, where the Protestant evangelical church preaches an individual gospel and an individual relationship where each individual is held accountable for individual sins. The Catholic Church knows about communal sins and preaches a message of love and service to community, but also guilt within the community. And both messages have their benefits and their drawbacks. Both messages can find root inside the biblical text. And this is not an episode where I want to say which one's right and which one's incorrect. I did record an episode titled Are Catholics Christians Too? So if you want a more in-depth discussion, I encourage you to go back. You might have to scroll a little bit, but go back and look that one up. And if you still have further questions, by all means, reach out and let's talk more about it. But suffice it to say that when you look generally at conservative policies, they focus more on individual rights and individual liberties. And when you look at liberal policies, they focus, again, generally more on communal rights and communal liberties. That when a conservative thinks about illegal immigrants in a country, a conservative thinks about the individual illegal immigrants committing individual crimes. And when a liberal thinks about illegal immigrants in the country, they think generally more about the family. They think generally more about the community of illegal immigrants and what they've done as a whole, not what each individual member has done. And so that's part of it. But there's also been a couple studies done. The most recent one was in 2010. So again, not incredibly up to date, but it was run through a British university, Cambridge, fairly famous, and found that when you look at Carl Jung's big 5 personality traits, which are ocean, right? Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Those are the big 5. That there were 2 personality traits that when someone had them, and if you remember from previous episodes, or feel free to look this up, but personality traits are a spectrum. So if someone is high on openness, they're not necessarily an open person. They're just more on the openness side of the spectrum than on the consistent and cautious side of the spectrum. And same thing with conscientiousness. If someone is high in conscientiousness, they're more orderly and less chaotic. They care more about efficiency than they do about being easygoing or relaxing. Same thing with extroversion, right? Someone who's higher in extroversion is more outgoing, and someone who is lower in extroversion, we would call them more introverted, is more solitary and reserved. And same thing with agreeableness. Someone who's high in agreeableness is very low in challenge and low in confrontation. And someone who's low in agreeableness is someone with a high challenge in character, perhaps even a skeptical nature. And then neuroticism doesn't mean crazy, right? But someone that's high in neuroticism is someone who's high in sensitivity, is someone who's high in emotional affect, and someone low in neuroticism is someone who is low in emotional affect and generally more secure in how they're presenting emotionally. So you could say even more confident. And the interesting thing in the study done by Cambridge is that there were kind of small movements in the needle as far as extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism went when looking at the study group of people and how they tended to react and vote politically with their views. Like, for example, those that were more conservative or Republican-leaning were just ever so slightly more extroverted, so more outgoing, than those that voted with a liberal or left-leaning view. And so what does that mean? Well, not really much, because it's such a wide group of people that when the needle's that close to center, you can't say that all conservatives are so much more extroverted than all liberals. So it doesn't really tell you much, except for maybe that there were a handful more conservatives in this study that had greater levels of extroversion than those in the study with a liberal point of view. And then same thing with agreeableness. The conservatives were slightly more disagreeable, but again, the needle was fairly close to center. So it's not like you can point to agreeableness and say someone who is very agreeable, very, very friendly, and with low challenge is always going to vote liberal. Well, the needle didn't move that much, so that's not what the study is saying. Similarly, with neuroticism, those with more emotional stability tended to vote more conservatively. But again, the needle was fairly close to center, so you can't really make a general sweeping statement about people that vote that way in a political party. The interesting thing was openness and conscientiousness. The study found in many different factors, in many different political areas, economic areas, social policy areas, that on the whole, more people in the study who identified with liberal points of view on all those different factors were very high in openness. So they were very curious. They were very compassionate for marginalized people and ideas and policies. And on the flip side, most of the people in the study who identified with very conservative points of view, economically, politically, socially, were very high in conscientiousness. So they were very orderly. They were very efficient. They cared about rules. And this spurned other studies that have been done, and you can look them up, and they found the same thing, that those that voted more politically liberally leaning were higher in openness, and those that voted more politically conservatively leaning were higher in conscientiousness. And my first thought when I read this study was how beautiful that is. Because I remember reading a book many, many years ago called The Sociology of Philosophy, and it talked about how philosophies change over time. And it's a very, very boring book, and I only recommend it if you're having a lot of trouble sleeping at night. But one of the kind of pictures that this book paints is that you have a general pervasive philosophy, and essentially all of your data points, if you picture like a scatter plot, are centered around this philosophy until one data point appears on the very, very margins, on the very outside, far away. And slowly over time, more people tend to shift from what was the center of the old philosophical view towards those on the margins and the outsides. And I find that fascinating because I think that when it comes to politics, there's a need for people that look on the margins, that look on the outside, as well as people that hold the group together. So let me explain what I mean by that. Orderly and conscientious people are needed in society because a society needs order. A society needs rules and laws and people to enforce those rules and laws. And I don't mean this term politically, I mean this term philosophically, but borders. It needs people who understand the borders of law. It needs people who understand the borders of morality, the borders of personal liberties and rights. But it also needs people who can look beyond those borders. Maybe borders is a wrong word to use. Maybe I should just use walls. I don't know. I don't know what word to use anymore. I don't mean borders like physical borders between countries. I mean philosophical borders. So if you can roll with me, then we'll just keep going. If not, I don't figure some stuff out. I'm not going to apologize for that. But a society needs people to look beyond those borders and to see the marginalized and to have compassion and to be open to what ideas, what cultures, what languages, and what people exist beyond those borders. And I think that that's largely been the strength of the United States, is that the orderly, conscientious people have been having dialogues with the open and compassionate people. And so, where am I going with this? When you look at the data, the Protestant evangelical believers in the United States have been shifting for the past 30 to 40 years. That if you look further back from that, 50, 60 years ago, there was more of an even split between liberal and conservative viewpoints within Protestant evangelical America. But slowly, there's been a shift to where now there's a stereotype of Protestant evangelical Christians that says that they will be voting conservatively. They will be voting with a Republican candidate. They'll be lining up with a conservative mindset. And I think one of the reasons for that is I think the borders have shifted too fast. And certainly social media has not helped this at all. And perhaps it's even worth asking the question if Christians should be on social media at all anyway, because I think what a lot of it is fear. I think when you shift the borders too fast, people become afraid of losing what they have, because what they have, when it works, it works. And when it works, it provides safety. And safety is a form of loving your community. You see, it's not that orderly and conscientious people don't have compassion. Far from it. They have compassion through their orderliness, through their conscientiousness. What they say when they see society is, if we can keep society the way it needs to be, if everyone can follow the rules, then everyone can be safe. Then everyone can be cared for. Then everyone can have an equal opportunity to do good, have good lives. And I think that's what conservative Christians want. It comes from a place of love, not from a place of hate. I think it manifests itself as something that appears like hate, but in the end, I think is really fear. I think there's a fear to losing the borders. Again, the philosophical borders. There's a fear to losing the orderliness, because when you have too much chaos, well, that's when really bad stuff happens. When you have too much chaos, people lose their individual liberties and people get abused in horrible ways. And rights for weaker people. And if this is offensive to you, I'm not sorry, but we just got to have this conversation, right? Like rights for women, rights for minorities, rights for society's outcasts start to go away when you have too much chaos. And so I think what you have is well-meaning conservative Christians afraid to lose that, afraid to lose the ability to protect their communities, their families, their friends, and their neighbors. And I think on the flip side of it, there's also fear. And I think you have liberal Christians, and now I'm going to use the word Christian to be more inclusive, to include not only your Protestant evangelicals, but also your Catholics. And I think you have liberal Christians who are also afraid. They're afraid that the government, the people that run it, the people that support it are just going to be selfish. They're afraid that they're not going to care about the poor and the marginalized. There's a bit more traditional communal values and mindset there. And I think we see that. And I think just as much as liberals look at conservatives and see hate, I think conservatives look at liberals and see hate. And maybe rightly so, because maybe that compassion is manifesting itself at hate, because there is kind of a, if you're not for us, you're against us mentality, especially when you have people thinking in a more communal mindset. And I'll be honest, I very much try to hold a realistic mindset. I very much try to see both the negatives and the positives of both sides of the political aisle. And I have, even recently, been accused by someone I know and by someone that knows that I try to not actually take a party side here. I have very recently been accused of just that. If you're not for us, you're against us. If you're not a liberal, you're a conservative. And I think that's just fear. I think instead of looking at different personality traits, looking at someone who's orderly and conscientious, and looking at someone who's open and compassionate, which, by the way, when I took the Big Five personality trait test, which you can take online, that utilizes the Jungian psychology of the Big Five personality traits, I was very high in both compassion and openness, which on cold statistical data would say that I should probably lean more to the left. But weird enough, I was also actually high on orderliness. So I don't know where to lean. And maybe my personality is just skeptical of everything. And that's, it's just messed up. I don't know. But the point is, people who are lower on the spectrum in orderliness should not villainize people who are higher on the spectrum in orderliness. The personality spectrum, obviously not the autistic spectrum. Anyway, words are so hard to use in 2026. I feel like this is just an interesting episode here, so forgive me for stumbling around my words. But we don't see that happening. We see the dialogue shifting from if you're not high in openness and compassion, you're the enemy. And if you're not high and conscientiousness and orderliness, you're the enemy. And maybe that's the way the world will go for a little while. Christianity is not liberal or conservative. Christianity says if liberals are your enemy, then you should love and pray for them. Christianity says if conservatives are your enemy, then you should love and pray for them. Jesus called 2 disciples a zealot, someone who hated the Roman Empire and hated tax collectors with everything in him. And Jesus also called a tax collector, and they walked together for 3 years. And they didn't kill each other, and they didn't fight. And they were both disciples, and they were both brothers. So that's all the time we have for today. These are my thoughts. This is a hard issue to talk about. There are so many voices out there and so many things on the internet. I hope maybe I've brought a different perspective for you to at least consider. And I'm well aware that this might be a charging topic for many of you, and it might even provoke you to anger. And if it does, know that I'm ready to have a conversation with you. I would just ask that we do it civilly and politely, but I would genuinely love to hear from you. What are your thoughts? Leave a comment, share the episode, shoot me an email, and as always, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed the show.